Right now, somewhere in your skull, a narrator is talking. It's been talking your entire life. It's telling you who you are, what you like, why you did what you did yesterday, and who you'll be tomorrow. You've never once questioned this narrator. Why would you? It sounds exactly like you. It uses your voice, your memories, your opinions. Here's the problem. That narrator is not reporting the facts. It's making most of them up. The you that you wake up as every morning, the person with the fixed personality, the stable preferences, the coherent life story, doesn't exist the way you think it does. It's not a discovery. It's a construction, a story your brain assembles after the fact, edits without your permission, and sells back to you as truth. And once you understand how that story gets written, you stop being its subject. You become its author. In the next few minutes, we're going to pull back the curtain on the single most convincing illusion the human brain produces, the illusion of a fixed, continuous self. We'll look at the neuroscience that exposes it, a real case that pushes the question to its most extreme edge. And then we'll build a practical, four-part framework for taking the pen back and rewriting the story on purpose. Let's start with the uncomfortable part. For most of the 20th century, psychologists assumed the self was something you uncovered, like an artifact buried in sand. Enough therapy, enough reflection, enough soul-searching, and eventually, you'd hit bedrock, the real you. But research on the brain has quietly demolished that idea. What neuroscientists have found instead is a self that is manufactured in real time, moment to moment, by a process that never stops running and rarely tells the truth about what it's doing. The clearest evidence for this comes from a series of experiments conducted on patients whose brains had been surgically split. The corpus callosum, the thick cable connecting the left and right hemispheres, severed to control severe epilepsy. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga studied these patients for decades, and what he found changed how we understand identity itself. The two hemispheres could no longer directly communicate. Gazzaniga could feed information to just one side of the brain and watch what happened. In one experiment, researchers flashed an instruction to a patient's right hemisphere, the nonverbal side, telling them to get up and walk. The patient stood and started walking. Then researchers asked the patient, using language processed by the left hemisphere, why they were walking. The left hemisphere had no idea. It hadn't received the instruction. It didn't know the real reason. And yet it didn't say, I don't know. It instantly invented an answer, something like, I wanted to get a soda, confident, immediate, completely fabricated. Gazzaniga named the part of the brain responsible for this, the interpreter. Its job isn't to accurately report what's happening inside you. Its job is to construct a coherent story about you, no matter what it has to invent to do it. And here's the part that should unsettle you. That interpreter never turns off. It's running in your head right now, stitching together your actions, your moods, your history, into a narrative that feels true, because it's the only version you've ever been given. This lines up with what psychologist Dan McAdams calls narrative identity, the theory that your sense of self isn't a list of static traits, it's a story you continuously compose, revise, and perform, usually without realizing you're doing it. You don't just have a past. You have an edited past, one where certain events get promoted to defining moments, and others quietly get cut from the footage entirely, depending on what story you're currently trying to tell about yourself. Ask a person who sees themselves as a failure to describe their life, and they'll unconsciously highlight the setbacks. Ask a person who sees themselves as resilient, and they'll pull from the exact same set of raw events and highlight the comebacks. Same facts, different edit, different self. If that sounds abstract, there's a real case that makes it almost impossible to look away from. In 1985, a brilliant British musicologist named Clive Waring contracted a herpes virus that attacked his brain, destroying his hippocampus, the structure most responsible for forming new memories. What followed was one of the most devastating cases in the history of neurology. Clive lost the ability to hold on to any new memory for longer than about 30 seconds. Every conversation, every thought, every moment of awareness dissolved almost as fast as it formed. He would write in a journal, over and over, I am awake for the first time, then cross it out minutes later and write it again. Now I am really, completely awake. Cross out, repeat. For decades. By every definition of narrative identity we just described, Clive Waring should have had no self left, no continuous story, no accumulating chapters, just an endless, isolated present, severed from everything before it. And yet something in him survived that the disease couldn't touch. When his wife Deborah walked into the room, even if she'd only stepped out for 30 seconds, Clive would light up with genuine, overwhelming joy, as though reuniting with her after years apart. He couldn't tell you her name reliably. He couldn't recall their wedding. But something underneath the narrative, call it emotional memory, call it the felt sense of love, remained completely intact. And when he sat at a piano, a skill encoded in procedural memory rather than narrative memory, his hands still knew Bach. He could conduct a choir. He could perform pieces flawlessly, with total confidence, despite having no memory of ever having learned them. Clive Waring is proof of something profound. The story is not the self. The story is a layer built on top of something deeper. Your capacity to feel, to connect, to skillfully act in the world. The narrator can be destroyed, and love still walks through the door. The narrator can be destroyed, and the hands still find the keys. What Clive lost was the illusion of continuity. What he kept was everything that actually mattered. Most of us will never face anything close to what Clive experienced. But we are, every single one of us, walking around with an interpreter, constantly fabricating a you that we've mistaken for bedrock truth. The good news buried inside all of this unsettling neuroscience is enormous. If identity is a story rather than a fact, it can be edited, deliberately, on purpose, by you. This is where most people go wrong. They try to change their behavior directly, force new habits, white-knuckle discipline, hope the story catches up eventually. It rarely works, because the interpreter keeps defaulting back to the old script. You can't outmuscle a narrative. You have to rewrite it. So here's a 4-part framework for doing exactly that. I call it the Recast method. Part 1. Audit the script. You cannot edit a story you haven't read. Spend real time, not 5 minutes, an actual sitting, writing out the core sentences you tell yourself about who you are. I'm not a disciplined person. I've always been the anxious one. I'm bad with money. Get them out of your head and onto paper, because as long as they stay unconscious, the interpreter treats them as fact rather than as one possible draft. Most people are shocked to discover how many of these lines were written by a version of themselves that's 10, 15, 20 years out of date. Part 2. Find the founding scene. Every one of those sentences has an origin, usually a small, specific moment your brain decided was defining and has been quietly reinforcing ever since. Maybe you were called lazy once by a parent under stress, and your interpreter built an entire identity around defending against that word. Maybe one public failure got promoted to proof that you're not smart enough, while a dozen quiet successes got cut from the footage. Find the scene. Naming it strips away its authority. It's not a law of your nature. It's a single frame your brain overweighted. Part 3. Write the counter-evidence. This is where most self-help stops short, because affirmations alone don't work. Your brain doesn't believe a sentence it has no evidence for. Instead, actively go hunting for real, factual counter-evidence to the old story. If the story is, I'm not disciplined, find 3 real moments, not hypotheticals, actual memories, where you followed through on something hard. Write them down in detail. You're not lying to yourself. You're doing what the interpreter already does constantly, selectively curating the evidence, except now you're aiming it toward truth instead of habit. Part 4. Perform the new draft. Narrative identity isn't just written, it's rehearsed through action. Every time you act in line with the new story, even in some small, almost embarrassing way, you feed your interpreter new footage to draw from. Say you're rewriting the story from I'm anxious in social situations to I'm someone who can handle discomfort. You don't need a dramatic transformation. You need one dinner where you speak up once. That single data point becomes raw material the interpreter can start weaving into a new script. Do it enough times, and the interpreter, the same mechanism that invented a lie about wanting a soda, will just as confidently start narrating the truth about who you're actually becoming. Here's the reframe underneath all of this. You've probably spent years treating your personality like a diagnosis, something fixed, something you were handed and have to live with. But the neuroscience says otherwise. You are not a stone tablet. You're a living manuscript, and the interpreter in your head is going to keep writing whether you participate or not. The only real choice you have is whether you stay a passive character reading a script assembled by old wounds and outdated evidence, or whether you pick up the pen. Think about Clive Waring one more time. Stripped of every chapter, every memory, every version of his own story, what remained was love and skill and presence. Not the narrative, the substance underneath it. That's true for you too, right now, buried under whatever story you've been telling yourself for years. The story can be rewritten. What's underneath it was never broken in the first place. If you made it to the end of this video, that already tells you something about who you are. You're the kind of person willing to sit with an uncomfortable idea long enough to actually use it. That's rare. Most people never make it this far. So if this gave you something worth thinking about, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.